Let's start by talking about the challenge set by Target around this transition to a low-carbon economy. So what do you include and what do you not include?
Solar, biofuels, wind.
How those new and emerging technologies are accelerated down that pathway.
Everybody needs to take responsibility for cutting their own emissions.
Harry, thanks very much for joining us today. Harry, you're leading the work on corporate footprinting in the Carbon Trust, but I have to confess, I don't actually understand what corporate footprinting actually is.
The idea of a footprint is it's the total set of greenhouse gas emissions that your organisation is responsible for putting up into the atmosphere. Now we can think about different sets of emissions. There's the ones that you're directly responsible for example, burning fuel in your car, gas in your boiler to heat your offices, for example. And then there are other types of emissions where you've got a slightly more indirect relationship to them. Maybe if you buy some products, part of your supply chain, there will be emissions associated with producing those raw materials, or indeed with the electricity you consume. So indirect emissions. But if you put all that together, you get your carbon footprint. Now, to make footprints comparable between different organisations, it's quite important to draw some rules. And there are various different sets of rules. Most important come from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was put together by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And that allows us to, first of all, define what the organisation is and what it is that you want to measure the footprint for, and then secondly, make sure that we're calculating a consistent set of emissions within that footprint.
So having got a corporate footprint, what's the corporate supposed to do with it?
Okay, so the Carbon Trust recommends that organisations take a three-stage approach to managing their carbon emissions. The first stage is to reduce the emissions that they're directly responsible for. The second stage is to reduce the emissions across their supply chain. And the third stage is to potentially offset the remaining emissions that you can't reduce. Now, understanding your footprint allows you to know what quantity of emissions you're starting with, both within your organisation as a whole and across potentially your supply chain. By understanding that measurement, you can then think about how you're going to target and reduce those emissions over time. And you can actually, by measuring your footprint year on year, you can track your progress.
So measuring footprint requires, presumably, quite a lot of data.
It does require a lot of data. You need to get data from a number of different sources, including your gas and electricity bills, potentially the business travel that your employees are taking, the transport that your company owns itself, so if you have company cars or a distribution fleet.
Once a company has got its footprint, what can they actually do about reducing it?
Well, there's a range of things they can do. The first thing that they should look at is where are the emissions coming from? So what are the major fuel sources, the major things that are actually creating these emissions in the first place? And then they can put in place a targeted action plan, typically covering, first of all, training, awareness raising amongst your staff, making sure that it's really on their agenda and that they're doing the simple things. Secondly, there's often a lot of maintenance activity that companies can undertake to make sure that equipment's functioning properly and things are working as they should. And thirdly, you can invest in more efficient equipment over time, so that might be more efficient PCs or it might be a more efficient piece of industrial equipment, for example, at a manufacturing firm. So there's a graded process of investment which should be repeated year on year as you discover more about where your emissions are coming from.
Right. And in your experience, more and more companies are recognising there is an issue here. Do they actually realise the magnitude of the changes that are actually ahead?
I think businesses are beginning to wake up to that. There's been a lot of press recently. There's been a lot of awareness. This term carbon footprinting, for example, has really come from nowhere in the last 12 months to become quite common currency. It wasn't actually being mentioned in 2006 in the press at all. So I think there's growing awareness, and I think leading businesses are now putting in place the strategies that will allow them to deliver these savings in the long term.
Right, and there is going to have to be some public visibility to the work that businesses are doing. They're working out their corporate footprinting according to the rules you pointed out in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Is there any way yet where those companies who are following that kind of methodology, that kind of approach, can demonstrate publicly that they are on the right track?
Well, many organisations put this information in their annual reports, and that's a good start because that means that investors can look at it. Bigger organisations also use the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a global network of investors, and they ask information from companies. But for smaller companies, it's maybe tough. There is a scheme, though, from the Carbon Trust that can help, the Energy Efficiency Accreditation Scheme. This scheme is an independent stamp of approval for a company's performance both in measuring its energy usage and then in actually reducing that over time. So organisations that have been through that process and they're assessed every 3 years really can say with confidence to their customers that they are taking steps to actually get on the right path.